As a native Missourian, I have been around gun culture most of my life. We never had guns in my home, but I still took the hunter education course and I learned to shoot. And that seemed to be the very bare minimum required to be a member of my community. And many of my friends and family hunted. They shot for sport. They had a rifle rack in their pickup truck, or they carried a pistol in the glove compartment of their car. Eventually, both concealed and open carry became increasingly popular and common in the places where I lived. And you probably know the stats. In the 2018 Small Arms Survey, the U.S. outpaced the world in the estimated number of firearms per 100 residents, with 120.5 civilian-owned guns for every 100 people. If you want to compare that to other places, Yemen, which is not exactly the image of peace in the world, had 52.8 guns per every 100 people. Canada had 34.7. But from 1997 to 2010, I moved around a lot, from Northern California to rural Missouri to Cambodia, with short-term jobs in Russia, Indonesia, the UK, and Guatemala peppered throughout those years. In most of those places, people lived with memories of violence, often recent and traumatic violence, yet though state-sanctioned violence remained, I can't remember a single friend who wanted a gun. Unless you count Vladislav, who was a member of the militia and more the exception that proved the rule. These were people with clear memories of violence that could inspire the type of self-defense, gun-obsessed rhetoric that fills so much of American culture. But for the most part, it did not. I wanted to test my personal experience by comparing it to available statistics. Data from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington allowed me to compare the age-standardized mortality rate due to gun violence per 100,000 people in all those nations that I lived and worked in over the years. The UK and Indonesia had lower rates, 0.3 and 0.4 gun deaths per 100,000 people. Cambodia was at 1.5, followed by Russia at 2.6. When we came to the United States, we took a big jump, all the way up to 10.6 deaths per 100,000 people. Tragically, Guatemala has followed its region's trend toward the worst gun violence in the world, with 32.3 gun deaths per 100,000. In fact, the study showed that half of the world's gun deaths in 2016 occurred in just 6 nations, and all of them in the Americas. Brazil, with more than 43,000. The United States, with more than 37,000. Mexico, more than 15,000. Colombia, more than 13,000. Venezuela, more than 12,000, and Guatemala, more than 5,000. None of this is probably new to you, but that is just another layer to the tragedy. Why do the news stories about gun violence keep returning week after week, year after year? Why do we keep having to have this discussion? Many people I know have even become somewhat resigned. They've kind of adjusted to this reality of watching the gun deaths pile up year after year, matched only by the baffling increased enthusiasm to continue to own or even stockpile weapons that were designed for no other purpose than to take human life. Other friends have bought their own guns, especially friends of mine who belong to marginalized communities, in resistance to the injustices and the lack of safety that we experience. But in whatever way we relate to the unfathomable number of gun deaths each year, whether that's boredom or resignation or outrage or grief or determination or something else, we still face this common question: why? Why do we keep coming back to this point time and again? When a society continues to embrace an ideology or action that undermines its overall well-being, especially when it resists change that would make things healthier and better, it's often a good idea to try to get underneath that ideology. What is it that's driving us to behave in ways that just makes things worse? The challenge is that when it comes to guns, there isn't a simple answer. Guns are woven into our culture in so many ways that it's difficult to untangle all of those strands. Not long ago, Henry Giroux made an impassioned and important plea for us to change the deeper structure of life in the U.S. in order to end mass shootings. He described, in his words, a culture awash in guns and violence, a society that nourishes and rewards the gun industries and values the accumulation of profits over human needs, connecting that economic interest with the priorities of neoliberal economics. And that is no joke. The largest 100 weapons and military service companies in the world recorded $531 billion in sales in 2020. Jerome makes the case that, quote, even as specific policies are debated, what is ignored is a neoliberal economic system that feeds on self-interest, inequality, cruelty, punishment, precarity, and loneliness. Neoliberal society fuels a criminogenic system that celebrates violence both as a source of pleasure and as an organizing principle of governance. This deep structure of neoliberal violence has other consequences, not least of which is preventing meaningful action on climate change, while profiting off the destruction of the very planet that is a home to us all. But the economic interest alone doesn't account for why it is so difficult to transform this nation's violence and its morbid and deadly fascination with guns. As Giroux had pointed out, neoliberalism feeds on self-interest, inequality, cruelty, punishment, precarity, and loneliness, which in turn it helps to perpetuate and uses to protect its interests. But neoliberalism inherited those qualities, inherited those conditions, and it relies on pre-existing injustices to continue. Untangling all those threads isn't something to be completed quickly, if ever. But some of the threads are more like ropes or chains, and chief among them is the role of white supremacy and racism in the development of the United States gun culture. Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz knows this both as a historian and as someone who grew up immersed in gun culture in rural Oklahoma. For a time, she even belonged to an armed radical left group that amassed a huge arsenal of weapons. She would say, a firearm slung over your shoulder or a 9mm Browning tucked under your belt creates a sense of amplified power without which you feel naked and vulnerable. Guns are awesome. They are also beautiful objects that are addictive. Her honesty about that power is an important aspect of an oft-hidden side of gun ownership, the relationship of communities excluded from access to power and justice, and their relationship to guns. It is this experience, however, that gives Dunbar-Ortiz such a powerful perspective on gun culture and violence in the United States. And she rightly insists that we, quote, cannot make sense of gun hoarding and the cult of the gun if we don't deal with white nationalism. And we can't deal with white nationalism without dealing with United States history. Guns, of course, were there from the beginning and then codified into the young nation through the Second Amendment. The context of that amendment's well-regulated militia was simple. It enshrined into law the right of white settlers to violently displace indigenous peoples and to violently maintain race-based slavery, such as through slave patrols. Dunbar-Ortiz explains that this, quote, long intergenerational violent struggle to take the land is why descendants of those mostly Anglo and Scots-Irish settlers today believe they are the authentic lords of the United States and should govern, a kind of blood right. This history may be unknown to many people, but it is not a secret. Long-form essays and entire books have been written on it, from Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz's recent Loaded, Disarming History of the Second Amendment, to Clayton Kramer's The Racist Roots of Gun Control, Cultural and Diamond's The Second Amendment Toward an Afro-Americanist Reconsideration, and Richard Slotkin's trilogy on the evolution of gun culture in the United States, Regeneration Through Violence, The Fatal Environment, and Gunfighter Nation. Slotkin's work on the historical mythology is especially helpful, at least to me, charting out how the glorification of social, historical, and political violence was individualized in the developing nation. In the historical context of racism and white supremacy, such as in the Jim Crow era, almost any kind of violence could be enacted by a white person towards a black person. A white man could shoot a black man, for instance, who simply had refused to share the sidewalk without fear of consequences because, in Slotkin's words, no jury will convict. In a real-world example that he shared, he described how a successful black farmer had refused to sell a crop in South Carolina and was ultimately lynched for it. So, Slotkin observed, we granted to private citizens the right to police the racial boundary and the social boundary. Those rights were both symbolic and literal. Early gun laws focused on outlawing black people, free or enslaved, from possessing or carrying guns. In 1825, law in Florida gave white people the right to enter any and all, quote, Negro houses and seize any weapons and ammunition that they found there. The infamous overtly racist decision in the 1857 Dred Scott versus Sanford case included the argument that black people could not be granted citizenship under any circumstance because that would also give them the right to own guns. In the post-Civil War Jim Crow South, black codes commonly made it illegal for black people to have guns. The spirit and enforcement of these laws persisted down through the years, even as times changed. For example, officials denied a concealed carry permit to Martin Luther King Jr. even after his family home had been firebombed. The history continues to impact us even today. As Adam Winkler wrote in the Harvard Law Review, for example, some scholars have argued that modern laws that deny the right to keep and bear arms to people with felony convictions are constitutional in part because the founding generation had laws disarming people thought to be unusually dangerous or unvirtuous, such as black people, Native Americans, and enslaved people. Although clear that legislatures no longer have the power to adopt racially discriminatory gun laws, these scholars argue that racist gun laws nonetheless reflect a legitimate and constitutional power by legislatures to disarm people who are deemed either dangerous or lacking in virtue. The legislation of the past is hardly neutral. The racism embedded in so many gun laws reminds us that such legislation was enacted not out of a solemn attempt to police the boundaries of the Second Amendment, but in an effort to abuse the law to protect racial privilege and hierarchy, end quote. These observations by Dunbar, Ortiz, Slotkin, and others also point to another reality of this deep structure underneath the legal aspects. Culturally and psychologically, the association of guns with racial privilege and hierarchy, that's alive and well. Understanding this helps us understand why opposition to sensible gun laws can be so aggressive and often illogical. It also helps us distinguish between the experiences of people who have historically and currently benefited from access to guns, such as white people, and marginalized communities whose access to guns has been most controlled even while they suffer the most violence. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Kerry O'Brien published a study on racism, gun ownership, and gun control. Biased attitudes in the U.S. whites may influence policy decisions. That gives us a powerful glimpse into how this deep structure lives inside of us, especially for white people in the context of anti-black bias. The whole study is worth your time if you enjoy such things. But the heart of the finding is this, quote, after adjusting for all explanatory variables in the model, symbolic racism was significantly related to having a gun in the home. Specifically, for each 1 point of increase in symbolic racism, there was a 50% greater odds of having a gun in the home. And there was a 28% increase in the odds of supporting permits to carry concealed handguns. To put it another way, there are plenty of gun owners who are not necessarily racist. But the more racist a person was, the more likely it was that they would own a gun and oppose life-saving laws. The researchers noted that if we were simply operating according to logic, it should be reasonably easy to convince U.S. citizens to take action to address gun violence, because it would be for everyone's well-being. everyone would benefit from it. Yet, in the study's words, U.S. whites oppose strong gun reform more than any other racial groups, despite a much greater likelihood that whites will kill themselves with their guns, suicide, than be killed by someone else. Black-on-black homicide rates would benefit most from gun reform, and quite logically, blacks support these reforms even if whites do not. Symbolic racism appears to play a role in explaining gun ownership and paradoxical attitudes to gun control in U.S. whites. In other words, despite certain policy changes potentially benefiting whites, anti-black prejudice leads people to oppose their implementation. This finding is consistent with previous research showing that symbolic racism is associated with opposition to U.S. policies that may benefit blacks and support for policies that disadvantage blacks, and critically, goes beyond what is explained by other important confounders." End quote. This is all consistent with the studies of Dr. Jonathan Metzl, a psychiatrist and sociologist at Vanderbilt University, who's documented both the history and the symbolic meanings of guns. In particular, he investigated how publicly carrying a gun was entwined with and coded as white privilege. Today, he reminds us, advertisers have literally used words like restoring your manly privilege as a way of selling assault weapons to white men. Drawing on that history of expanding borders, the violent displacement of indigenous peoples, and exploiting labor, the violent enslavement of black people, Metzl pointed out that, quote, John Brown's raid, that was about weapons. Scholars have written about how the Ku Klux Klan was aimed at disarming African Americans. When African Americans started to carry guns in public, think about Malcolm X during the Civil Rights era, all of a sudden the Second Amendment didn't apply in many white Americans' minds. When Huey Newton and the Black Panthers tried to arm themselves, everyone suddenly said, "We need gun control." So he asked the question, who gets to carry a gun in public? Who is coded as a patriot? Who is coded as a threat or a terrorist or a gangster? What it means to carry a gun or to own a gun or to buy a gun, those questions are not neutral. We have 200 years, he wrote, of history or more, defining that in very racial terms. This is making a diagnostic point rather than a prescriptive one. Metzl even acknowledges that he came to respect some gun ownership traditions and that many gun owners are deeply committed to gun safety and heartbroken about gun deaths and mass shootings. But those gun owners are not the whole story, and they cannot be used as an excuse to avoid healing a terrible history that continues to spill into the present, killing tens of thousands of people each year in the United States alone. That is, understanding why it is so difficult to make progress on gun violence must include understanding the racial tensions underlying the gun debate. The deeply polarized opinions about gun politics have emerged in the context of race, and guns have come to symbolize that deep wound. This is why Metzl insists that when we're talking about guns, we're also talking about race. This means that if we want to make progress on preventing gun violence, we'll likely have to do it without waiting for public opinion about guns to align with what our society needs. We have done this kind of thing before on issues like tobacco and seatbelts, but those issues were not as deeply rooted in our history and psychology or infused with such violence. But those successes can still give us some hope that over time, changing policies might be the best way to change attitudes and behaviors. One of the most promising directions for this is the movement toward addressing gun violence as a public health issue, moving the conversation into a different context and giving us a chance to look at these questions with fresh eyes and a commitment to our shared social well-being. For anyone interested in this, an easy starting point for learning can be found at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Far from the panicked fear that many gun owners have expressed about the government coming for their guns, the policy recommendations are oriented around safety how to be a more responsible, more accountable gun owner, how to have a society that is free of the most egregious types of gun violence. Based on the successes of reducing car accident-related fatalities, they advocate for increased funding for gun violence research and for firearm registration at the point of sale, for renewable licenses on each gun that's owned, and more rigorous safety standards and accountability for manufacturers so that they can be held accountable when guns are poorly produced or when they're used in violent ways. While we're working toward these policy changes, we can also be doing our part personally and relationally. First, because guns are inherently dangerous, right? That is their purpose. They are designed to kill. If you do own a gun, prioritize gun safety. Appropriate lock storage, regular maintenance, and continued training has to be the standard while encouraging others to do the same. And if you need any further motivation, please take seriously the fact that in the United States in 2020, 54% of all gun deaths were suicides. And over half of suicides in the United States involved a gun. Second, we need, again, I always come back to this, but we have to center and support marginalized communities and others who are most vulnerable to suffering from gun violence. Listen to them, learn from them, and support them in solidarity with their efforts to create communities where they are and feel safe. Ultimately, we are all only as safe as our most vulnerable members. This especially includes our attention and commitment to anti-racism. For fellow white people in particular, we have got to be intentional about rooting out our internalized dominance and encouraging other white folks to do the same. The world is witness that gun violence does not have to be the norm. But until the United States is willing to reckon with the deep structure and enduring legacy of our gun culture, we are not going to escape that violence. Gratefully, for all of us who long for healing and the peace that comes from belonging to a place without the constant threat of violence and death, we have a way forward. Let's go there together. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.